Good morning, friends and colleagues. Welcome. My name is Michael Thomas. I'm the president of the New England Board of Higher Education. We are grateful to all of you who are joining us this morning for this important discussion about the emerging ecosystem of credentials and alternative credentials in post-secondary education. We continue to expect our crowd and our participants to grow as we get going here this morning. But by way of welcome introduction, I just want to say thanks to everyone who is joining us. A great selection of leaders in post-secondary education and beyond from New England and beyond as well. I want to say special thanks certainly to our speakers, which I will introduce here shortly, but also to our NEBI team for all of their help and support in making today's event possible. And then, of course, lastly, thanks to all of you who are taking your valuable time and energy to be with us this morning for this conversation. And we look forward to your thoughts and your input throughout the conversation. We've got a great group of speakers here this morning, as you well know. We're joined by Maria Spies. She's the co-CEO and co-founder of Holon IQ. Holon IQ is a leading market research and analysis firm based in Australia. Maria is, as I said, co-founder and co-CEO and has previously experiences working as the digital head of digital learning futures and part of a corporate venture fund focused on innovation and global education. We're also joined by Holly Zanville. She's a research professor and co-director of the program on skills, credentials, and workforce policy at George Washington's Institute for Public Policy. Many of you also know Holly from her notable work with Lumina Foundation, where she led a number of national initiatives related to credentialing and innovation in the post-secondary credential space. Lastly, we're joined by Jonathan Finkelstein. Jonathan is the founder and the CEO of Credly. Many of you are familiar with Credly, who helps institutions, employers, training organizations, associations, workforce development organizations, and others translate learning experiences into professional opportunities using trusted, portable digital credentials. And as we talk today about the changing nature of credentials, we'll certainly think about the notion of digital credentials and the changing nature of the credential itself as we see the development in the credential ecosystem. So I want to say thanks to these three individuals in advance for their time. Maria joins us from Sydney this morning for us, but very much end of day for her. So we appreciate her time and flexibility. I just want to say a couple of quick words about the New England Board of Higher Education. I know many of you are familiar with NEBI, as we are known. Founded in 1955 by governors, legislators, and leaders of post-secondary education in the region. We're one of 4 regional higher education compact organizations. We were built to provide a collaborative structure for post-secondary education, workforce, and policy leaders to work together across their various sectors, but also across the 6 New England states. We provide a variety of programs, services, and research resources focused on cost savings, affordability, performance improvement, and meeting the needs of learners and employers in New England. Some of our representative work and programs include our regional student program, which allows students to access programs in other New England states at a notable discount, saving them and their families just shy of $100 million a year. Significant work today, these days on our Independent College Transfer Guarantee Program, which creates pathways from 2-year institutions in the region to 4-year independent institutions, as well as public institutions. NEBI is also doing significant work through our North Star Collective these days, focused on supporting faculty diversity throughout the 6 New England states and the well-being of our BIPOC faculty members in institutions in all the 6 New England states. So those are a few examples of the programs that we've been involved in. The impetus for this conversation really springs from some work that was supported by the TIA Institute, who's been a really great partner to me and to NEBI over the years, focused on thinking about next generation digital learning infrastructure. So we called it the NGDLI, Next Gen Digital Learning Infrastructure Project. It was really focused on, particularly post-pandemic, thinking about and understanding the digital future of post-secondary learning and really working to catalyze post-secondary leaders and particularly trustees and boards of trustees to think about the future of the post-secondary learning enterprise. We did a variety of research projects. The first was a survey of presidents nationwide about their perspectives on the future of the post-secondary learning enterprise. Another brief focused on sort of the forces that are defining the future of post-secondary learning. I'll say a little bit more about those in just a second. And then lastly, sort of a, if you will, sort of a call to action relative to strategic governance, an action framework for post-secondary leaders to really think about and to effectively use means of governance and post-secondary education to move institutions to really thinking about and achieving these digital learning enterprises of the future. As I mentioned, we have thought a lot about sort of forces that are really defining the future of post-secondary education, many of which have been radically accelerated by the recent pandemic. Digital transformation, the evolution of work, the educational technology boom, and also changing currencies of learning. We'll obviously focus a lot on the evolution of work today, and particularly on the changing currencies of learning, which really is the foundation for today's conversation. But as you can appreciate, these are forces that have been at work certainly across the globe in advance of the pandemic, but have been notably accelerated as a consequence thereof. And really, you know, fundamentally sort of the pitch here is that the units and the pace of post-secondary learning in many ways are misaligned with the need for flexible and on-demand learning that learners are increasingly expressing a preference for, and certainly as they, you know, even beyond sort of traditional post-secondary education involvement, really have need for as they seek to advance in their work life and careers. And sort of one of the premises we talked about was this idea that the fastest learner wins. That's a phrase borrowed from a chief human resource officer of a global corporation, but I think it really captures both on a societal and an organizational, business and industry side, as well as on an individual side, this notion that opportunities to advance in timely, meaningful, workforce-connected ways are really, really critical, and increasingly sort of an impetus from some of the trends that we'll talk about today. This notion, again, of changing currencies of learning, very critical. We make the argument in our work that higher education institutions are really no longer at the top of a credential hierarchy, but they've been sort of if you will, sort of nested in what we're calling, of course, this credential ecosystem. And they have new and diverse and complementary roles that will require them to work more effectively with other participants in that ecosystem as they mint or grant credentials, as they value the credentials and assess the credentials and learning that learners access and attain in other areas of their lives, and as they create sort of aggregated pathways and connected if you will, sort of trails for people to be able to walk through their life in bringing together their learning in meaningful ways. So in many ways, it's a rethinking of some of the roles and an amplification of others for post-secondary institutions. But certainly this idea that the core product of the traditional 2 or 4 year degree is going to see change, and certainly is seeing sort of pressures from outside in terms of alternatives there too, is a real phenomenon. So with that, again, I won't get into too many details. We know that as the leaders of post-secondary institutions are very interested in digital infrastructure because of its ability to expand their non-degree offerings. But we also know that they don't necessarily fully sort of perceive or, if you will, account for the reality of the real external competitive pressures that are and are going to continue to be placed on them by alternative providers as it goes to meeting the need for and the demand for these type of credentials. So with that, I want to turn it to my colleagues. Maria has kindly offered to kick off our conversation to share some of her perspective. As mentioned, Maria really leads, in my opinion, one of the best sort of market evaluators and perspective organizations that has a unique global perspective about the changing world. And so Maria, we'll turn the time to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I love having these conversations. You know, this is a global conversation. Things are happening, trends happening. These types of trends are happening all over the world. Let me just share my screen now. My sort of part of this session is just to provide a bit of a global overview about what we're seeing in the area of new credentials, whether they're alternate or not, but certainly new. And let's just kick that off with firstly, quite a lot of the work we've been doing over the last couple of years has been identifying lots of things happening, lots of changes, lots of trends, of course, but really what does that mean in terms of those strategic shifts? And we've identified these 4 interrelated strategic shifts in higher education. And the very first one there in blue, of course, is new credentials. Like Michael was talking about, shorter, more flexible from a range of providers, are becoming more valued by learners and by employers, and increasingly also recognised by governments. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Education Work Nexus, very, very related to new credentials. Borderless competition, a whole new range of providers who are delivering different types of credentials, and that means new competition for what has traditionally been a fairly stable and group of traditional providers. And finally, of course, omni-channel learning, which if all of the audience are at universities, you know this very, very clearly, which is, you know, pressures to deliver not only just online or on campus, but to deliver online, on campus and blended all at the same time. So these are these 4 sort of interrelated strategic shifts we're seeing, particularly accelerated through COVID. One of the things we also do is try to size markets. Sizing markets is important, not for the dollar value per se, but to get a feel for how fast something is growing. How much is the world spending on a particular market or segment? And in this case, what we see is something like $100 and something billion online degree and micro-credential market by 2025, growing quite rapidly. It's the curve is one thing to look at, of course, the growth, but also the sort of underpinning sort of assumptions that we've made here in sizing this market. So, you know, 2018, 2019, sort of very strong growth in online degree programs, just continues to grow, although pre-COVID, compared with on campus, still relatively small, but growing much faster, where in, you know, sort of overall higher education enrollments are actually shrinking globally, certainly in the US. And then, of course, we saw a big bump in COVID to a flip to online through necessary means. And what we're seeing and what we expect to continue to see is a bit of an unbundling, particularly in the postgraduate market, unbundling of those postgraduate credentials, and that's built right into changing nature of work, continuous upskilling requirements, etc., like that. And then as we go forward, we expect to see more undergraduate sort of on and off ramps. So the sort of structure of degree programs, even at the undergraduate level, being pulled a little bit at the edges by on ramps and off ramps that could be, you know, micro credentials or alternative credentials at the beginnings and at the end. So that's the sort of thing that we're seeing, and this is all related to those strategic shifts. I mean, what are micro-credentials? That's a very good question, because it's still a fairly messy market. It can mean anything from, we've tried to visualize here, it can mean anything from something quite large, like half a year's worth of content, or something very small, such as 10 hours or even 1 hour of content. And so we have an initial problem, which is definitions. And so this slide here shows, compared with the underlying grey of a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or an associate degree, you can see all different types of players delivering all different types, sizes of learning, and calling them micro-credentials. So the very first thing we have essentially is a definition problem, although these things are getting a little bit clearer. And what we had done is pull apart this whole market to try to put things into categories to understand it better. And so here you see things from everything from short courses, you know, you might find on LinkedIn or Degreed or Pluralsight or something, through to boot camps, 500 to 1,000 hours worth, 3 to 6 to 9 months worth of learning. And that's, you know, those tech boot camps that you will all be familiar with, through to professional certifications and licenses. Of course, they've been around for a long time. Essentially, they're micro-credentials or alternative credentials. Non-university issued non-degree certificates. These are nano degrees, you know, micro masters, things like that, through to university issued, through to degree programs and accredited programs. So there's a whole spectrum here, and delivered by a whole different group of providers. When we flip that on its side and size that, how big are these things? you can see here that boot camps through to online non-degree certificates, professional certifications, and then just a whole range of online courses and badges is the largest and the most fragmented market. This is not becoming less fragmented as time goes on. It's just getting bigger, essentially, and with a lot more people piling in, a lot more organizations piling in to deliver solutions. And all this, of course, is playing around in the post-secondary education market, which is traditionally the university's backyard. One thing I think that's really worth talking about is the infrastructure that's building for micro-credentials or alternative credentials. And when I say infrastructure, not necessarily technical infrastructure, but the policy infrastructure. And so across the world, we are seeing governments really turning their attention to the support of alternative credentials. In the US, of course, the Learning Credential Network. I mean, the US is more state-based, but we do see states building solutions or support, or at least trialing and piloting things. American Council on Education doing their blockchain challenge, and most of those, if you have a look at those, are related to recognition of learning, which is not full degree programs. A digital credentials consortium, a consortium of global universities trying to provide infrastructure for that. The World Economic Forum is already talking about global skills passport. In Australia, a national micro-credentials framework has been launched, and now it's being embedded into the qualifications framework. Singapore is way out ahead. They've had this in place since 2015, quite organised. In Malaysia, government departments are getting together. Typically, it's your workforce and education government departments joining forces to deliver a micro-credentials within a framework en masse. I mean, we're talking 50,000 training places this year alone, right through to 3 million in 5 years. And that again being supported, endorsed, funded by governments. And in Malaysia, as an example, where micro-credentials universities are required to join in the micro-credential national initiative. And so they're trying to build bridges through policy and funding between a formal traditional sector and new micro-credential solutions. What are universities doing about this? Well, I think every university, I haven't seen an analysis of every university, but I'm 100% sure that pretty much every university has either got or is seriously considering a whole micro-credential strategy. Now, micro-credentials are not really new, essentially. Lots of universities have their short course department that's been operating for a very long time, and often they're being rebadged and reorganized and given more prominence in institutions. And then they're building a whole new strategy. But universities are also partnering with, for example, here, the likes of boot camps, because tech skills are something that people need, and they need it fast. And universities are typically not built for rapid cycle, high-tech sort of courses, which are more vocational in nature, essentially. And so there's a huge number of universities who are partnering with boot camps in order to join forces and deliver these. And you can see the shape of that graph says it all in terms of the number of partnerships, and that continues to grow. The question, of course, for boot camps is, can they scale beyond the tech subjects? Can they scale into other things? And we're yet to see, that take off. One of the things that we also do is ask our higher education networks, about 3,000 universities around the world, where are you at with micro-credentials? What are you doing? What are you thinking? And so at the end of last year, we did a global poll of our university network, and we asked them a couple of questions, which I thought I might share here as a spark for some discussion later. One of the questions, of course, was, what do you think about when will micro-credentials become integrated into most university offerings? So it's sort of deliberately, the question was deliberately asked around when may it become integrated. Of course, 13% said never. These things are separate. It's good, micro-credentials are fine, but actually these are separate things. But the vast majority of respondents indicated that in the next decade, really micro-credentials will become much more integrated into university offerings. And indeed, we are seeing universities deliver short courses and micro-credentials, not necessarily integrated into their offerings, but some are, and we're seeing a little bit of that. We also asked about what is the top barrier to scaled adoption of micro-credentials. By far and away, the largest one was the constraints in recognition and quality assurance. People don't know what they are, number one. They're not recognised, number two, and they're sort of a bit concerned about the quality of micro-credentials because there's this massive marketplace of all sorts of things from 10 hours to 1,000 hours. And so that was seen as the biggest barrier. The complexity of offerings, lack of understanding and lack of trust, those things can be built on, but if they're not recognised and if people don't understand what they are and there's no QA around them, quality assurance, then that's really a blocker. And so my comments earlier around governments starting to define and recognise is a really, really big issue. Because it has the possibility of overcoming this barrier. And finally, we asked our university network about the status of micro-credential adoption at their institution. And so you can see 70%, this was December, November last year, 70% they consider themselves emerging in this space. And so, we'll continue to do this survey and we'll see over time how that changes. But most universities are actually moving forward, but not feeling like they are completely mature in this area. So just to wrap up my part of this session, as a summary, micro-credentials are definitely sort of moving forward. Many providers are increasingly delivering and endorsing alternative learning options, whether it be institutions or employers or tech companies, but the micro-credential landscape is still very, very complex and fragmented. And the lack of digital solutions for recognition and storage and so on does remain a barrier, although we're seeing movement in that space. The EU, for example, is moving forward at pace with micro-credentials by 2025. The European Union will have, their plan is to have a completely defined and organised micro-credential solution across Europe. And so once that starts happening, the problem of understanding and validating sort of disappears a little bit. And governments around the world are starting to build national platforms, create incentives, and once they start recognising and incorporating micro-credentials into qualifications frameworks, what will happen next is they'll start funding them. And once universities, once governments start funding known and regulated micro-credentials, then the game changes a little bit for existing providers. And so that's the sort of landscape we're seeing globally. And then that's the end of my part of the presentation. So I'll hand back, Michael, to you because I know we've got more great conversation to go.
Great. Thanks a lot, Maria. Really fascinating, I think, perspective, both in terms of the marketplace, as well as I think this really critical element that you've spoken to, which is this, the question of infrastructure, supporting organizations and policies and even technology, but certainly a variety of other elements that we will get to, I think, further in our conversation. I neglected to note at the outset that all of our participants are invited to engage in the conversation. You have, as you're probably aware on Zoom here, a Q&A function. So we would encourage you to use it at any point during our conversation today. Feel free to provide general questions to all of the panelists. If you want a specific response from one of our particular panelists, don't hesitate to note that as well. But we'd love to have your thoughts and your input and engagement, and certainly share with us your perspectives and learnings from your sort of vantage in this ecosystem as well, which would be really helpful, I think, to all of our participants. So Maria, you mentioned again these important elements of sort of infrastructure and systems. And as we hand it to Holly, I think certainly Holly stands out as one of the people in the US who I think has led a lot of the thinking and the work for the process of creating that infrastructure and those policies to help support the more effective emergence and sort of productivity of the alternative credential space. So Holly, will hand the time to you.
Thanks so much. So good morning, everyone, and almost midnight to you, Maria. Thanks so much for providing such a good overview about a lot of things that are developing globally. What I'm going to do today is focus on trains, and this is my love of trains, so this is my favorite metaphor. But I'm going to focus on the trains of innovation that are literally burning track across the nation and many other nations. And thanks. With destinations like blockchain, stackable credentials, digital badges, skills-based hiring, and competency skills frameworks. And I'm sure most of the people in the audience know that we could have a signpost that would probably have 30 directions on this, which is part of the confusion in our system. The two trains that I'm most involved in these days that most of you may not actually know about yet are called Credential as you go, with a destination to build an incremental credentialing system in the US, and a digital wiki model learn and work ecosystem library with a destination to inform folks about our learn and work ecosystem, which is very messy, as Maria already indicated. Before I briefly describe these, I'd like to share 4 key drivers that a lot of us think are really fueling the redesign of our higher ed system: a dated degree-centric system, equity, credential expansion, and rapidly changing 21st century workforce needs. So the first driver, increasing recognition that the US has a pretty dated degree-centric system around our 4 degrees, associate, bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees. But the problem is it's taking too long and the cost is prohibitive for many to complete, especially learners who are needing to focus on work, family, and other obligations. The system is not recognizing partial degrees, and often people without a degree are treated as if they have no learning. This really hinders, of course, their employment options and hinders further their education. So the second driver, and I don't really have a slide for this because it's such a complicated issue and we do have a lot of data, is around equity, the lack of fairness in our current system. The 2019 census in the US informs us that about half of the adults in the US have no college credential, and this actually may have increased due to COVID in the last couple of years. There were 81 million adults without any post-secondary credentials in 2019, and nearly 40 million who have some college but no credential. This latter group was actually acquiring knowledge and skills that could potentially have been counted towards shorter-term credentials when they were enrolled in college, but we didn't have a system, we don't have a system for recognizing this learning. There is a clear differential between students of color and their access to completing credentials in higher ed compared to white students. The largest proportion of those who do have some college and no degree are Black adults who also carry the highest debt load. 51% of white adults are degreed, but for Latinx adults, it's 27% degreed. So the changing demography and the interests of our diverse population are a really important driver in the transformation needed ahead. So the third driver, and Maria already mentioned this, is credential expansion. The US credentialing landscape is really confusing and it's chaotic. It's getting worse, not better. There are nearly 1 million unique credentials awarded from 4 types of credential providers: the post-secondary education institutions, the MOOC providers, the non-academic providers, and secondary schools. And I hope that you all know about the work that Credential Engine is doing to produce reports that are trying to follow this literal explosion of credentials in the US. So the demand for new types of credentials, especially since the start of the pandemic, has grown substantially in the last 5 years, driven in part by growing demand for certificate programs and alternative credential offerings. The number of open badges awarded, for example, nearly doubled from 24 million in 2018 to 43 million in 2020. As the acceptance of new types of credentials has grown, and we think it is growing, a number of employers have become learning providers in their own right, another complication, moving beyond training their employees or providing tuition assistance programs to send their staff to higher ed institutions, to also developing their own curricula and expanding their public-facing credential offerings. A fourth driver is really our changes in the 21st century workforce. Our workforce is really different than it was 40 years ago. While employers still need workers with industry-specific knowledge and skills, what we typically call technical knowledge and skills, hard skills. Employers are increasingly valuing 21st century skills, and there's so many names now that have emerged for this. Human, power, soft skills, there's probably 2 or 3 others at least. And many of the employers are struggling to find workers with the knowledge and skills to enable their companies to remain competitive. You all know this. And so this is adding a lot of fuel to the solution. We think we need to transform the higher ed system. And actually, it's not just the higher ed system, it's the learn and work ecosystem, I would argue. So those are some of the key drivers. And I want to turn for a few moments to solutions, because it's one thing to make a case that we need to make change. It's another thing to talk about what are the solutions for change. And again, I'm going to talk about trains, because that's what I like to think about. And I would say that the solutions are really adding up among many of the train tracks. And the first area of big development is the ones that are moving into the education providers. And they have solutions like stackable credentials, guided pathways, reverse transfer, associate degrees, apprenticeships, career and technical education, digital badges, certifications embedded in degree programs, and many others. There are also a rash of trains that are carrying solutions specifically to employers and workforce groups. They have destinations like skills-based hiring, job postings in the language of competencies, building a diverse workforce, tuition assistance programs, awarding employer credentials, internships and other work and learn programs, and partnering with higher ed to meet employer needs for upskilling. Then there's a bunch of train solutions around quality assurance, accreditation reforms to accommodate or at least to consider non-degree credentials among the credentials that higher ed institutions offer, the standards boards, many of these are global, not just US, industry, learning outcomes frameworks, licensing boards, national exams, various occupations, and unions. And there is the trains that are pulling heavy database cars. They're trying to answer questions that inform us about how well our system is working or not working, actually. There is data collected from education providers, mostly of enrollment and completion. Think about NCES and the National Student Clearinghouse. But there are the job ads databases, resume databases, wage and employability databases, gig worker databases that are emerging, supply and demand databases. And the latest one that I saw is college return on investment database that has just been developed by the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce. So I just sketched out 4 of these. I won't go on to more of them, but I want to let you know that we think that these are 4 large categories in the ecosystem, but there's another 4 and that are very, very important that Maria already touched on. Record keeping and verification systems that are verifying skills and competencies, including non-classroom learning, and that are building digital records to be able to enable easy exchange throughout the ecosystem and over a lifetime. There are the policy and incentives that set the rules, accountability, and resources from federal and state policies, employer programs, union programs, and community-based programs. There's the career planning area of activity to help individuals actually navigate our really messy, confusing system. And communications is another part of the ecosystem for the folks that are trying to explain to the public and to niche audiences how the learn and work ecosystem works. And a lot of folks don't think about communications as a key part of the ecosystem, but a lot of us would contend it is part of the ecosystem. So here's, just to get off the train tracks for a moment, here's the list of 8 core areas of the learn and work ecosystem. And there's some more, but we think that these are the key ones. So you will all no doubt heard the report a couple of weeks ago from the National Student Clearinghouse that we are now up from 36 million to 39 million in that category of adults who have some college and no credential. So there's much attention now, as it's been actually for several years, to trying to get the 39 million back to complete degrees and other valuable credentials. But we should ask ourselves, why did 39 people leave without a credential? Not why did they leave? We know why they left. And there were lots of good reasons for them stopping or leaving. But why did they leave with nothing? That's the question. Did none of them did none of the 39 million actually acquire useful learning along the way toward a degree before they stopped or dropped out? And this is a conversation we hope, we have a young cartoonist who joined a project that I'm working on to try to put this into a cartoon of 3 faculty in the faculty lounge, who hopefully would conclude, if they looked at the data, that there was valuable learning for many of them, but it wasn't recognized. But maybe it could be recognized, and maybe we can fix our systems, and that's a solution. Figure out a way to do what a lot of us are calling, and a lot of us, I want to go to some key stakeholder groups who are in these conversations. A lot of us are calling incremental credentialing. Start recognizing learning along the way before they get to one of those 4 degrees, because we think learning is occurring in smaller increments along the way. So incremental credentialing really is a way to capture learning as it's acquired along the learning pathway and formally recognize it and connect that learning to a larger context. These would be non-credit and credit bearing. They would be undergraduate and graduate level. They're any size, from small units of learning through degrees. So what I'm now moving into is some of the thinking that's going on behind the scenes around the project From Credential as You Go. And given the limited time today, I'm not going to go into the details of implementing an incremental credentialing system on the ground, but I want you to know that there's a framework that has developed of at least 6 ways that workforce learning and credentials can be brought into credentialing pathways, where smaller credentials can build into certificates and degrees, and where there can be intermediate credentials between degrees. I'll interject just a bit of information about the organization behind Credential as You Go. The work actually started with a planning grant from Lumina Foundation when I was a strategy director there, and the grant went to SUNY Empire State College. SUNY faculty from 2- and 4-year institutions developed this incremental credential framework. And then we moved to a phase 2 effort, which kicked off just this last September, supported by a 3-year federal grant from the US Department of Education's Institute of Educational Sciences. The collaborative initiative is led now by 3 groups: SUNY Empire State College's Center for Leadership in Credentialing Learning, the Corporation for a Skilled Workforce in Ann Arbor, and the Program on Skills, Credentials, and Workforce Policy, where I am at George Washington University. We also are working with a large national advisory board to date of 118 influencers, and many of them are coming from that list of stakeholders that you saw in the other slide. So to touch briefly on where is the work starting, we're focusing on rapid prototyping of incremental credentialing in New York, Colorado, and North Carolina, working with the state systems of higher ed and institutions that are joining kind of cohort groups. And there's a very large body of work that's falling under this. In order to try to display this, we've come up with what we call the Credential as You Go umbrella. And basically, we're working with faculty at both 2- and 4-year institutions in those 3 states. Both, you can see in green the community colleges and in black the universities. And this is year 1. There will be more institutions that are joining in years 2 and 3. And we also have Alabama that has requested to join us. And we think Alabama will be joining us in January. They're starting a planning year with us. So we're hoping that we'll be expanding quickly. So just to touch briefly on what goes under the umbrella, in addition to rapid prototyping of incremental credentials, there's a national campaign to build understanding and support for this concept of incremental credentialing. There's a very important research emphasis in this, because that's what the federal grant program is interested in. And we are needing to understand whether or not, if you build it, will it work? So we have a key research question. Will we have a fairer higher ed system if incremental credentialing takes off? And so in those 3 states, we're going to be collecting data as individuals start moving their way through the incremental credentials that the faculty are developing right now in a range of disciplines at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. So a 4th area is around training and technical assistance. A 5th is around equity and inclusion. We don't want a system that leaves learners with dead-end options. Not that dead end is an option, I don't think. Policy change is really, really important to support incremental credentialing, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. Trust in quality of incremental credentials and building interconnections with other initiatives. And we asked each of the 3 states to do a landscape study for us of what other related initiatives were going on in their state. most of them were at 20 or more. That tells you how much of this activity is going on and how difficult it is, particularly for the state systems of higher ed, but the faculty at the institutions too, to know which project are they working on, how do they go together, all these data systems that are needed in order to collect data. So I would say it's not even initiative fatigue anymore. It is confusion in how do we identify all that and put that out there. And before I leave the umbrella, I just want to touch a bit more on policy, particularly state policy, because we have the fact that in many of the states, the public four-year institutions need a change in statute in order to award even an associate degree to students that begin with them. Well, now I'm talking about the universities now, who are not allowed to offer anything other than a bachelor's degree. That doesn't work in the 21st century learn and work ecosystem. And those students who started at a university are not going to all transfer to a community college. This does not make sense. Our structure is not working for us. So many of the states, and you probably have seen in the press, the recent policy changes in Colorado and in New York, which are allowing this, being permissive around enabling both community colleges and universities to make the kind of changes that they need in order to implement what we're calling an incremental or credential educational system. So I'm going to move along here. And one of the concerns we have now is just about how crowded all this is getting. And in order to explain to all of us how our learn and work ecosystem works, we're working to develop a wiki model digital learn and work ecosystem library. Think of Wikipedia. And if you did a search right now and you typed in learn and work ecosystem, you'd get a prompt from Wikipedia that says, we don't have anything like this, but if you want us to build one, let us know. So we're trying to build our own. And when you type in a lot of the words, blockchain is there, and a lot of words that you've heard are there, but there's a lot of words that are important in the learn work ecosystem that are not at Wikipedia. And that's because it's kind of a niche area, and it's in a lot of our heads, and we need to get it someplace where people can understand what this world means. So we sent out a survey to a number of experts around the U.S. There actually were a few international folks who we asked to weigh in just because we were interested in comparisons to evaluate and at least give us a rating on how important categories that might make up a learn and work ecosystem were. Because frankly, we're trying to think about what would be the card catalog, thinking old school now, if you went to a library and wanted to say, what are the categories that make up the ecosystem? And you can see how they were rated percentage-wise. I was disappointed that global didn't do that well, but that doesn't surprise us because I think most people, most of the US experts think primarily about US issues, but we know, a lot of us know that what is happening globally is really, really important. And we have got to follow developments and have an open understanding in order to move our learning forward. So these are the categories that we think roughly will make up the learn and work ecosystem, and we're going to start putting meat on these bones to build the library. We also asked the folks to rate 97 subcategories we came up with, key words, terms, concepts that are active in this work. And so we have the ratings. I'm not going to share all those with you, but I have a report if anyone would ever like to see that. And so we're using that in order to inform the development of the library. And just to let you know, there will be 3 components in this library. There will be the knowledge component. You could go there to just learn about the key components and the definitions and who's using them and what are the subcomponents in the ecosystem. And they would include links to other websites for further information. Think about air traffic controllers. You could get some basic information here, and then we're going to try to send you off to the places like, if you want to know about apprenticeships, you should really know about Jobs for the Future and the Department of Labor. There really are a few key places to go. Then we would also identify at the library what are key projects that are working in these areas to improve aspects of the ecosystem. Most of the projects don't work in all of the spaces of the ecosystem. They may focus primarily on employer solutions, or some may focus on the credential providers. But there are projects in all those areas that I mentioned earlier, and we are trying, we want to make that available to folks who know who are the key players who are trying to make these improvements. And the third are the networks and alliances that are focused on various of these components. And there's a tremendous hundreds of these networks and alliances, and we're trying to identify what those are. So the last slide I'm going to go to as the looking forward slide. And I've got some trends. I always keep my list of things I think are happening, Maria. I don't have it probably as well informed by data like you do, but I think, and we've talked with our board at Credential as you go about many of these, we think that there is growing recognition that many micro-credentials like badges and certifications are critical in our learner work ecosystem, contrary to the view by many, particularly in higher ed, that their add-ons are nice to-dos. We think they're more than nice to-dos. That micro-credentials will become more important in certain industry sectors. In working with the 3 states, it looks to us as though, and I've seen this in national publications, that about 50% of the new alternative or the new types of micro-credentials are likely to be in healthcare. And we think that there's also a tremendous growth in cybersecurity and IT, and in areas such as veterinary tech. Who would have thought that that would be a growing area? It is a growing area for everybody because of all the pets that they've acquired during COVID, we think. At any rate, certain industry sectors are going to lead this. It will not be even growth. We also think that many graduates, employees, and employers are not going to be interested, unfortunately, in obtaining more formal credentials. Rather, they're going to be focused on skill, domain development, and certifications. Navigating this system is going to be more confusing, especially for students and employers. There's going to be more efforts to embed micro-credentials into traditional degree and certificate programs. So we're going to see a lot of these hybrids that are going to be emerging. There's going to be more growth in micro-credentialing by providers outside higher ed. This is going to just add more and more confusion. There's, with the range of providers, growing questions, as we've already heard, about quality and value, and accreditors will pay attention to and reassess the review approaches. The Higher Learning Commission is already meeting with their board about whether or not they need approaches to looking at non-degree credentials and what they should be doing in the space with the institutions that they are working closely with. There's going to be more growth at the graduate level, more R&D on who is affected by micro-credentialing, especially low-income, race, ethnicity, gender, and age populations. Growing pressure to digitize all valuable learning onto learner education and employment records that are going to be portable. Student and learner self-sovereignty is going to emerge as a phrase we all know. And it's going to be earned over a learner's lifetime, not just those 4 years or 6 years that they're in a higher ed institution, let's say. And the developments, last but not least, they're going to be global. They're not going to be US only. So I'm going to stop sharing and looking forward to the discussion.
Holly, thanks a lot. Maria talked about sort of the messiness of the marketplace, and I think you spoke of sort of the slightly chaotic nature of this emerging ecosystem, but I always understand it better when I listen to you. So we're very appreciative. You've done a lot to give us sort of definitional boundaries and ways to sort of frame and understand that. So thanks very much. And, a quick sort of tidbit. I did read the other day that one could make the argument, I think, that the largest grantor of credentials in the United States is actually an institution called Thomas Edison State College, which doesn't actually have a faculty and doesn't really have degree programs. It mostly pulls together learning from varied sources. So I think that's sort of an interesting reality in our own system that most people may not be aware of, but I think is central to what you've been describing. And you mentioned also this whole learn work ecosystem. And I think Jonathan has been sort of at the heart of that, and particularly this notion of, if you will, sort of skills-based denomination, if you will, of learning. And Jonathan, tell us more about your experience and your take on this ecosystem.
Sure, I'm happy to. And after all of Holly's terrific train analogies, I kind of imagine her wearing maybe an engineer's cap next time, not just for the train analogies, but because of your role, Holly, in providing so much leadership to this space. So thank you, Michael, for the invite, and Maria for the broad view, getting right down to some of the on-campus sentiment that we're hearing. Maybe what I'll do first is just very quickly give you a sense of my point of view. So everything I say that follows, you kind of understand the worldview that we hold at Credly. Credly, which is now part of Pearson and a central part of Pearson's strategy around lifelong learning. Our vision at Credly is quite simple, and I think probably be hard for anyone to disagree with. A lot of folks who I think share this vision, which is a world where every person can achieve their full potential on the basis of their verified skills. The way Credly has approached this in the world is, I think, best described through our mission, which is how do we help organizations make better human capital decisions using trusted information about what people actually know and can do. Our thought process around this has been that one of the major factors holding back people from achieving their full potential is that there's a lack of real-time information when it comes to making decisions. And that means that decisions around who to hire and who to promote and who to put on what project and what skills somebody might need to tap up or to top up their existing skill set and become even more valuable in the workplace. All of those things rely on largely self-reported information in places where there is verification. It tends to be at a very summative level and historically in very different formats, from paper to PDFs being the state of the art into the last several years. And as a result, you wind up with decisions that get made not only with inaccurate, not real-time information, but information that perpetuates inequities and reinforces systemic biases and problems in our labor market that keep people back from achieving their full potential. So that's how we've kind of framed our work. And I think you can see from a lot of what we've heard from Maria and Holly and Michael at the outset here, there are a lot of trends converging on why there's so much attention around thinking about credentials and how they might address each of these issues. One, obviously, is a whole lot of attention around skills. Skills have always been something we all care about, but I think we're in a world now where we actually have the tools to measure at a granular skill-based level. We don't have to just ask our faculty members to assign a summative grade or give a degree. We have systems and tools and platforms that are assessing and recording and allowing people to leave their footsteps in the snow, so to speak, as they learn. And so why shouldn't we be representing learning at a skill-based level? After all, that is what those making human capital decisions are largely judging their decisions on. Can I trust that you can do what we need you to do? And can I trust that you can grow and continue to evolve in your role? And that leads to the second trend, which is with all of the chaos and all of the different initiatives and programs and micro credentials of all different shapes and sizes, how do we know what we can trust? Trust as an individual choosing what to pursue in the world in terms of next steps, but as companies and organizations making hiring and other talent decisions, how do you trust what skills mean what and who has them? And that leads to that I think very important third pillar here that I mentioned earlier around equity. I mean, if we're living in a world in the US, for example, where 26% of Black Americans hold a bachelor's degree, and that compares to just over 40% of their white peers, we know we've got a problem, and we can't be relying on the degree alone to make human capital decisions. We know that the talent is more equitably distributed than that stat would suggest. And so that really reinforces the kind of messaging we were just hearing from Holly around two of the initiatives that she is most actively involved in right now. If you zoom in a little bit further and look at the headlines, I think you can kind of understand why the employer point of view here matters so much, and why I think it would be foolish for all of those in higher ed to kind of think about these worlds as disconnected from each other. When you look at the headlines, I think one thing that's very clear is that individuals are thinking about their life as a lifelong learning pathway. They're not just looking for a place to work anymore. They're looking for a place to learn. And so employers have recognized that. And I think what you start to see is employers branding themselves and presenting themselves as a great place to upskill. Don't just come and work for us and do great work, but universities employers are becoming the lifelong university. You might not stay more than a year and a half or 2 or 3 or 4, but while you're there, you're picking up skills. And the expectation is now that employers are going to credential you as you work. Just in the last year and a half or 2, Credly has seen a 400% increase in those organizations that are employers that are issuing digital credentials to their own employees. That is not a coincidence when you look at headlines around the Great Resignation or women who have in a disparate way retreated from the workforce during the pandemic. People are looking for more flexibility. They are looking to have a reason beyond the paycheck to work with their current employer. And that speaks to employers' role in certifying arguably one of the most important types of learning, and that's applied learning. What can you actually do on the job? That serves the individual, gives them currency that they can transact with inside and outside the company, but it also serves the employer because it gives them real-time knowledge of who's got what skills. It gives them windows into where they might need to do upskilling, including in partnership with higher ed institutions that can uniquely help fill those gaps. And I'll kind of round out our thoughts here in a moment with some, I think, maybe some key directions that if your institution isn't already exploring, you might want to think about. So I think the movement here is real. We're talking about a skill-based approach to talent. I don't need to remind this group, I'm sure you've seen companies like IBM and Google and EY and even the federal government either relax or remove the degree requirement from job descriptions. That's got to be a wake-up call to all of those of us who do work in higher education. This is real, and it's not reversing itself. In fact, it's only accelerating. The way that we tend to think about all of this is, yes, through the lens of skills. Skills are the currency of the modern labor market, and one of the reasons they are a currency, I think, is tapping back into credentials, which have been a way of transacting around skills for hundreds of years. Credentials have existed, but they've existed in just a few denominations. If your institution issues 4-year degrees or bachelor or graduate degrees, those might be the $100 or the $1,000 bill of this credential ecosystem. But as you get more involved in short form programs or lean more into your non-degree and professional education programs, you might think of those as the $50 bills or the $20 bills. And maybe some of the things within your courses are dimes and quarters that add up to greater currency. But we have the technology, especially in digital form, to recognize all kinds of denominations. And the reason I feel very comfortable at thinking about skills as currency is because they are now, it's much easier to back that currency with the full faith and credit of an organization like yours, of regional institutions and governments, of employers and companies that stand behind the assessments and the skills that those credentials represent. When it was self-reported, put it on your resume, put it on your professional profile online, the credentials don't have as much value. But when they're backed by a third party who knows that the credential says as much about them as an organization as it does about the individual who's earned it, you create an ecosystem on which you can actually transact when it comes to human capital. Just very, very quickly, I think, the attributes of a credential in digital form, which is a core part of the work we do at Credly. It's trusted sources, as I was just speaking to. It's transparency into what the specific skills that were assessed as part of this learning or assessment experience. And because of that X-ray view, if you will, of what these credentials actually mean, you're actually able to connect them in real time to additional learning pathways, such as college credit, going from the workforce to learning again, or to jobs in real time that are actually asking for and requiring those skills in a very regional, very specific way. So these become living, breathing connectors to the next learning experience, to the next promotion, or to the next job or career change. And so, I think one of the things that that emerges from all of this is the centrality of the individual as an HR department of one in choosing where to go, because the boundaries are breaking between who is the trusted provider of being able to assert somebody's skills. The way that we've thought about the world to try to unlock this potential is, you look around us right now, there are literally tens of thousands as we speak this very moment. I can tell you that because our systems are recording this in real time. As people earn and complete learning and assessments, they are earning credentials. And that's happening in all different places, whether it's Coursera or edX or any one of your institutions, whether it's happening at a boot camp or training provider or on the job. And so the work around credential standards and the work that Credly has really leaned into is saying, all that stuff is happening all over the place. How do we bring it together for the individual? How do we bring it together for those who are seeking talent? And so there's a pretty well-established set of standards now around how do you describe a credential in a similar way, regardless of where it comes from. We've got Coca-Cola and Pepsi. We've got Microsoft and AWS, Procter and Gamble, and Intel. I mean, groups that play in different worlds, play in the same worlds, but all speaking a common language about skills, regardless of the setting. And then you allow an individual to bring that together in a portable profile that they own that doesn't get locked up or left behind when they leave a given organization, whether it's an institution of higher learning, higher education, or if it's their own job, they get to carry it with them. And as a result, you're much more efficiently able to inform human capital decisions with the totality of somebody's trusted skill set. That's kind of how we operate. We think about this as a networked approach, and it's an ecosystem play. It's much bigger than Credly, even though I'm proud of the fact that many of the logos that we saw on Maria's slides are indeed operating on this infrastructure that we've built. And it's large, and I think if we look back even a year or two ahead, back to this moment, we're gonna see that this actually looks like a small start, even though I think it's pretty substantial to date. But we've got almost 3,000 organizations that are coalescing and issuing credentials in this common open standards approach, and they've issued coming on 60 million credentials already. The thing that's most exciting to me about all of this, that the boundaries are being blurred between traditional silos. And I think this is where there's a huge opportunity for higher education. As I said earlier, more employers today are issuing credentials than higher ed institutions, but employers are struggling to find quality signals. And they know that they are not always the expert in how to develop those skills. This is a world that is primed for really innovative partnerships with employers that can scale, and also partnerships with third parties that set the standard. I've seen a lot of great work around higher ed institutions. It's not just making a reference to a industry certification that they help prepare you to complete, but actually embedding and connecting that credential directly into the degree or non-degree program so that you finish with something that has industry recognition and that's backed by the institution, your institution's assessment and learning processes. The way, just so you have some frame of point of view on how Credly approaches this disparate ecosystem, we've got tools that help organizations issue credentials. We've got tools for the workforce, for employers, that give them a real-time view of what skills are resonant within their organization and how to help people connect to the right opportunity within their company and build talent pipelines. And that all includes reaching outside into the broader talent pool to connect to net new talent for an organization. Just a glimpse of how the work you do in higher ed can connect to this type of new thinking in the workforce. We're now seeing employers using tools that say in real time, who are the people at my organization that have been certified by X, Y, or university, or have picked up these skills, and were they picked up from a product certification or a professional certificate they did at a community college in our region. Being able to see all of that with trusted data that follows the individual is a super exciting way to think about how your degree and certificate and other programs can feed the workforce, and how you can actually develop the credibility around new programming as well. Just to wrap up here with just two final thoughts. This is just a sort of a snapshot of how we see higher ed really leaning into some of these trends. Whether it's demonstrating employer partnerships through co-branded credentials that improve trust that the program will yield employment outcomes, whether it is creating dynamic pathways between in real time and that where you can actually see how each skill you pick up along the way in your academic program leads to career outcomes or the right next learning opportunity. We're seeing the actual act of adding these credentials improve retention rates and improve enrollment in programs. So this isn't just a sort of a nice to have and a value add for the individual. We're seeing that it's super important to a higher ed institution's ability to retain the students that they work so hard to attract. And I think the other key component here is we're seeing higher ed institutions recognize that brand matters. Your reputation, your credibility matters. If there are out people self-reporting or claiming to have gone through your programs who didn't, it dilutes what you actually do offer. The brand is also important in attracting employees as well as learners. How do we show that your institution is a group that really cares about the outcomes that individuals will experience when going through your program. So there's a trust factor for the institution that's built up by being out there and representing what you care about in the world and what you're great at. And so finally, I would say just leaving you with maybe 3 directions where I think there's tremendous opportunity for innovation within higher ed. One aligns very nicely with what Holly was just describing with Credential as you go, whether it's for professional certificates, the degree itself, or embedding skills or industry certifications into your programming. All of that increases the relevance and the reward for an individual. I don't think I think the jury is in on this. Doing credentials as you go is not going to cannibalize your summative, your final offering. It's going to keep people involved and working towards completion, and it's going to increase the visibility and the value of your overall programs. 2 really interesting employer pathways and partnerships, whether it's co-branded credentials, employer partnerships around talent pipeline development. We work with groups like Facebook and Google and Amazon and Cisco, and all of them have programs that are connecting with community colleges and four-year institutions to embed pathways towards the kinds of skills that will be a great signal for an employer, not just for your first job, but for your 5th job. And so how do you make sure that whatever you're doing, it's really clear how it connects to a labor market result? And then lastly, I would say, and I think this is the one that I actually am, when I speak to CEOs and CHROs at large companies, I'm really encouraging them to think about higher ed as a new kind of partner. I know credit for prior learning has been around a long time, but it's a highly inefficient system today. It's really still on the individual to go figure out what school will accept their prior learning and whether it will count towards elective credit or whether it will actually create a shorter, cheaper path towards a degree. Even though there are good intentions on this, historically, it is reinforcing a lot of systemic problems and holding people back. And one thing I'd like to share is the early work that ACE is leading around a prior learning network to take what are evaluations for credit of industry experience, certifications on the work experiences, and create a guaranteed pathway for people into higher education where you get that cheaper, faster path towards the degree completion. Serving the adult learner through partnerships like this, I think, is going to be one of the ways that higher ed really shines in this new leg of the journey around credentials. I will leave it there, Michael, and turn back to you.
Fantastic. Well, as with Holly and Maria, I think you said some really important things that have stuck with me. The notion that talent is more equitably distributed than degree attainments or degrees, I think, is a really profound thought here. And this idea of giving people currency, I think that was evident in Holly's comments about these people have learning towards degrees and credentials, but it's caught somewhere that they're not able to bring into their own hands and their own pockets, right, to benefit them. And to your point, also just a currency of skills, to be able to take that learning and translate it into the terms. The denomination is the word you use that employers know and understand to help them leverage that. So I think those are really profound thoughts. We've got a question here that I'd love to jump into. I'll note just quickly that we will gladly share the slides from our presenters with everyone who's participated today, because I know there'll be a lot of questions. But first question is, what are the keys to re-engaging the adults with credits but no credential? And let me broaden that question just slightly for the three of you. Beyond sort of the marketing, the outreach, what are the institutional skills and capacities? Jonathan's talked about prior learning in a more efficient, less student burdening fashion, but what else do you think it'll take for institutions to be able to engage people with credit but no credential? Feel free to jump right in.
Go ahead, Holly.
I'll still jump in because the main portfolio I led when I was at Lumina Foundation was around trying to serve adults and what would it take to have people who already had gone to college but stopped or dropped out, what would it take to have them come back? And many of the states and institutions were trying recruitment, marketing, have them come back on the assumption that they could just market and they would come back. But what the data showed us was if the institutions didn't have programs that were relevant and they weren't flexible enough and they didn't do proper advising, folks were just going to drop out and leave a second or a third time, whatever number of times of leaving they were at, and they were not too happy about all of that. And so I think, and then comes more understanding of the 21st century workforce and this new array of credentials, and our sense is that most adults coming back, they may not be seeking a degree unless, and what we haven't talked about, and I always hate to get too much into the weeds here, but the fact is that certain professions are very much regulated and where there is licensing and there are degree requirements. And so healthcare and cybersecurity and some kinds of manufacturing, you kind of have to have the proper certifications. In many cases, it's a certain degree. So we're not talking, I don't think any of us, particularly in many key industry sectors, of just degrees are not going to be thrown out. On the other hand, to have adults come back and complete them is going to be a big challenge. And prior learning assessment for an adult who's been out, probably working, is going to be key. There is no reason for them to complete, particularly for military veterans and others. They've really experienced some learning that needs to be assessed, and we're not doing very well at that. But I would argue that there are many institutions that are beginning to ramp some of that up. They need really good advising. The programs have to be relevant. And these micro pathways are probably helpful. If adults will go, I think, for the shortest one that they can get in the career area they want to go. So in my mind, to really go after the 39 million, institutions will do best if they have the array of solutions, many solutions that are going to help those adults finish. Otherwise, people are going to come back and most of them are going to leave again and they won't complete. So that's kind of my short, it's an important question. I feel badly answering quickly, but that's my take on that.
Thanks, Jonathan and Maria.
I'll just jump in for quickly because I totally agree with you, Holly, that actually it could be way more damaging for someone who's started college and didn't finish, already feels like they've failed something. And so you don't want to put them through the same machine again. The machine has to be different in a way, servicing for those learners. Yes, recognizing what they've done before in some sort of way, and universities for a millennium have been very bad at that. It's hard to do. It's a tiny thing sitting outside this big sort of machine that it just can't cope with it very well. But the education design, the delivery design, who are these people? What are their needs? And can you reshape that learning around those needs? Now, that's a deeper question for institutions. And you see, the sort of models that institutions like WGU have in place, which are targeted exactly for those learners. But that's a whole redesign. That's not just sort of tweaking something around the edge. This is big redesign potentially. It can be done.
It's a great question. I don't have much to add to what Holly and Maria so eloquently shared, but I think transparency is one key. I think institutions need to be super transparent about their acceptance of those prior credits in a way that doesn't stigmatize those that have them. You should really be embracing it. This is the new world. These people were ahead of their time. They are not behind the 8 ball, right? The world that we are moving towards is one in which people will collect portions of learning programs all over the place that ultimately add up to something. And they don't all need to add up to a degree. And so to the extent you're leaning into transparency and destigmatization, also showcase the non-degree programs you have. They might not be the most expensive ones your institution offers, just to be really crass about it. But I think there's a huge opportunity for institutions to bring individuals back for a range of short form programming throughout their lives, which from a long-term business perspective, and many institutions do indeed need to think of themselves as businesses, is good for business. So maybe instead of the degree, maybe the right next step for that individual with some credit is a certificate, a non-degree bearing program. And maybe the next time you reach out to them after you've helped them get the satisfaction in their life that comes from completing something that has relevance in the market is another program, short form program. So I think it's about thinking differently and again, recognizing that the individuals with some credit and no degree are not lacking for life experience and skills.
I think those are really important viewpoints, and just from our work, just and building on some things that I think all three of you have said, and Jonathan most recently, and you were talking about employer pathways and partnerships. Certainly one of the barriers to adults coming back is that it's hard to get out of work and leave work or to learn without the benefit of working. And so the ability to work with employers and using Jonathan's example of how do you leverage the many credentials and or badges or things that employees are learning in the workplace and convert those from non-credit external credentials to for credit recognition can really help them towards their path, and certainly the demand for upskilling these days is just off the charts. Any survey that you see, employers just can't get enough of it. And to your point, they've tried to bring much of it in-house, but they recognize the importance of post-secondary partnerships in that. So I think, finding ways to build those partnerships with employers to, build that competency of, as I think Jonathan talked, this metaphor of, converting currencies and denominations into ones that could go towards certificates and or degrees is a really critical. Those are two competencies that I think institutions really need to think about building and expanding in their work. So great question. We've got another question here, and I think it relates a little bit to what you had talked about, Holly, around this issue of sort of, some regulated sort of professions and or degrees, and this question here of teacher preparation. And, does sort of transforming this start from the bottom up or the top down? Any thoughts or reflections on that?
I actually was really excited to see the teacher education question, because as we've been working with the 3 states, teacher education has come up in all of the discussions, because the faculty in the 3 states are coming up with their number of new credentials, incremental credentials. And I was a little surprised. Well, I was surprised to see veterinary technicians and the pathways to help people in veterinary areas that are emerging. But teacher education has been coming up. So that is a highly regulated profession. You need a degree and you need a license, but there are a lot of specialties in teacher education. So what it sounds to us is going to be happening in the prototyping states we're working with is they're going to be developing micro-credentials, or I'm not sure, badges. They're trying to decide what to call them, which goes back to the definitions issues in the different specialties. So maybe working with they might have their license in this, or elementary, secondary, but they might have a specialty in 3 different sub areas within teacher education. That will be very meaningful, and that will be helping them to get jobs and to change within their assignment. So we actually think that healthcare teacher ed, I should have mentioned that earlier, will be one of the career areas, profession areas where we're going to see a lot of changes in micro-credentialing.
I might jump in there as well, because that question is an important one, not using the example of teacher education, but any profession that absolutely requires some, entry degree. That is a degree, and it's this big, and before you can start operating in that job, you have to have that program completed. And so therefore, providing opportunities for those who haven't got that credential or who are partway through that credential or whatever is more difficult in terms of jobs. And that means we have to look to what's happening in the jobs. And in some areas, the nature of the profession is changing slightly. Look at healthcare, for example. Over the last 20 years or so, we've seen changes to the healthcare workforce, such as, doctors and, registered nurses, and legal, even lawyers, and now paralegal and paramedical. And, there's sort of more stratification of jobs which require different credentials as you go up. So the professions themselves are changing. The other thing that we could see is what I call back to the future, because there's nothing new in this. This is like the cadetship model, where people are partway through degrees. They are para teachers. That's not right, because paralegal, para teachers, allied health, allied teachers, they're sort of working their way in. There are jobs for those people in classrooms, but they're not the teacher trained professional. They're the next level down or the next level down. But that requires changes in profession. Because if education stays in a block, and it's a $1,000 bill, and you're not getting a penny, you're actually ripping a piece off the bill, and you can't use it except with the rest of it. And it's the same with jobs. If the profession is not changing, it's all or nothing. You get a degree or you have nothing. That also we have to see some change there. And I think we are. But the reason that things will change in workforces, like, for example, teachers, is because there is an absolute 100% chronic teacher shortage worldwide. Teacher profession has to do something about that, because the average age of teachers in the world is 52. And so they're all retiring as well. So something's got to give here. And that's it. So that was a great example on both ends, the education and the profession side of it.
Great comments, a great response. I think those are important questions. And I think your point is exactly right, Maria. The driving force here is, and I will continue to be, human capital needs, right? I think we've seen that. We don't see really any end in sight, particularly in developed economies, for demand for talent. And so all the more reason to really work closely with, I think, with employers in this process, because I think that's really critical for the points that you've made. And I know, Holly, you've been at work here. There's I think an important question from Thaddeus, for which we are grateful. The question around reimagining the transcript of the future. And Jonathan, I know you've got some thoughts on this as well. Maybe we'll have you all just give some quick, some rapid fire thoughts here. What does the transcript and or frankly, again, the credential of the future look like?
You want me to go first, Jonathan? So we're already embarked on, for the last several years, the comprehensive learner record that ACRO, the registrars have been working on with the U.S. universities, of course, to try to bring in non-classroom learning along with classroom learning. But in my mind, that's been important, but small potatoes, because the big potato is bringing in the learning from employer world and working in your community and other ways in which you've acquired skills, and then match that with what you learned at higher ed institutions. And higher ed institutions, rightly, the lawyers there will say, well, we can't document what we didn't see, what we didn't occur on our campuses. You shouldn't expect us to. So that's where that word self-sovereignty comes on board. We're thinking, like health records, there's going to be emerging learner and employment record, a LER, that is many folks are working on what they would look like, that will begin acquiring the learning that occurs from a lot of different places, not just LinkedIn, but it has to be verified and assessed, probably using blockchain. And Jonathan can talk about this more. And a lot of folks are trying to figure out, what will that look like? How will it work? And that this is likely the future. So the higher ed transcript is likely going to be somewhat less important. Employers don't typically like to look at a list of courses. They don't know what the student learned in the intro to sociology. They want to know, what skills do you have? And so the individual has to indicate and make clear what it is they've learned. And a lot of individuals don't know what they've learned. So the area of verification systems, assessment and verification systems, sort of under that big umbrella of transcripts, there's a tremendous amount of work. I don't personally know. I did my dissertation years ago about transcripting and changes. So it's amazing to me that here we are talking about transcripts all the time. But what's really going to happen are these new kind of records, like your health record. It's going to follow you. And I think Jonathan is a true expert in this area.
Well, that was great, Holly. Yeah, I think you're right. I think, what it looks like will continue to change. Everything we've looked at over the years, any digital artifact or way of presenting something will evolve and change. I think maybe I would think about it in the most future-proof way, which is, what does it look like for someone who has a more modern approach to the transcript? What can they do in their life that they maybe can't do today? You think about a transcript, I think to Holly's point, and I hope people take this in the spirit in which it's intended. There may be 1 or 2 moments in your life where you're asked to produce that transcript. I know this varies based on industry. It's really what it means to you and how you talk about it that is often what that degree, what that transcript represents, how you tell a story around it, how you contextualize the new things you did in the world and how you applied those skills. All of those things kind of hang on top of whatever experience you had. It's kind of like, I don't know, for those of you who are homeowners, I'm not sure if the last time you looked at the deed to your house. It's not something you typically pull out, or even the registration for your car, right? Like the average US person, I think, changes homes once every 8.5 years. So, but yet your skills are used every single day. And so the modern concept of a transcript is something you rely on every day. And it's not something you have to sort of pull out of your glove box or pull off a paper certificate hanging in a frame on your wall. It's living, it's breathing, it's dynamically connected to job boards and to talent mobility systems at your company and to prior learning systems at higher ed institutions who actually have something special to offer and how to help you put a capstone on the existing skills you have. So, but I think most importantly, and this is, I think, most notable difference in terms of what it looks like today, is it's owned by you. Unlike academic transcripts where you have to request it be sent each time you need it to a different third party, I think the gatekeepers around that document serve a very important function. But if you want the degree to mean something on a daily or regular basis, we need to think about how what that represents is something that not only gets used more regularly, but how you as an institution might write to it more regularly. And that's an acknowledgement that you don't own that learner. Whether they finished your programs or not, they're off to the next relationship, and they might have multiple relationships at the same time. So the modern profile, or the modern transcript, if you will, gets written to by every group that assesses your skills. It takes some humility for any one institution to be able to say, we don't own the transcript anymore, but there's a lot of upside to seeing the world that way.
And Maria, like Jonathan, I think you know a lot of people who are working on these problems, right? There's a lot of sort of entrepreneurial energy globally around these questions. I don't know if you want to share any thoughts on that. But.
Yeah, I think Jonathan pretty much says it all. The only sort of future visioning that I would put to that is I love it's a living thing, right? Number one, and I'd love to see that being integrated into the person, like it's you know, visual. It's like a portfolio. It's not just a list of stuff, you know, much more sort of living and I guess interactive and so on. I'd love to see that. On the technology side, that would be great, because it's an extension of you throughout your life. So
yeah, really helpful perspective. Well, we've hit our time constraint here, which I regret. And I think in particular for the benefit of Maria, who is kind to join us from Sydney time, who was well into the early morning. We need to bring what I think has been a really compelling discussion to a close. I want to thank certainly everyone who's participated and attended. Thanks for your questions as well. Holly, Maria, Jonathan, thanks a lot for not only your leadership and your work in helping to bring form to chaos and understanding to all the variations that exist in this credential ecosystem, and to help us understand how things are being repositioned and the future opportunities really for redefining the nature of learning. I know as we've thought a lot about this, you know, we've sort of borrowed the metaphor from, you know, if you look at for-profit businesses where you used to have large car manufacturers and rental cars, thinking more about the notion of being a transportation company rather than a, you know, car automaker. In higher education, I think it's rather than thinking about being degree granting institutions, how do we become learning organizations that can help support learning across the continuum of individuals' lifespans? And as I think all of you have said, really allow them to convert and leverage and have recognition for the currency that they have, and be able to bring that to bear to the important dimensions of their life, which are clearly, you know, further learning and career growth and empowerment, and at the end of the day, supporting obviously themselves, families, and societies. I think all really important pursuits. So again, I want to thank you for your leadership. To those of you again who have joined us, we'll be sure to share back with you the helpful PowerPoints that help frame the discussion, and we certainly look forward to further opportunities to continue conversation and collaboration as to what this means, particularly for post-secondary institutions here in New England and nationally. With that, thanks to all. We'll bid you goodbye and look forward to connecting again soon. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
thanks
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.